Hello digital builders, welcome to lecture 8 of CS220. In this lecture, we're going to focus on something called function scope. We've learned about how to use functions and how to write functions, and now we're going to learn an important thing, which is what's happening inside Python with all those variables that are inside our functions. Today during our lecture, we're going to think about the rules of scope. So you're going to hear me use that word scope a lot, and scope is basically the idea of where can we use a variable. Not all variables can be used everywhere in a program, and we'll talk about the rules of how that works. We'll also talk a bit about how arguments are passed into functions, and there's a certain way that it's done and the implications of that. And then finally, really the important part is, can you hand trace programs? The big idea behind hand tracing programs is not that we want you to work out a whole program by hand, but that by mentally thinking through the code that you write one line at a time, and that's what I mean by hand tracing programs, you can avoid a lot of the errors in your code that can take minutes or hours to find. Let's start first by talking about some context for all this. What does it mean to talk about the scope of something, or the scope of a variable? Well, a variable is a name for a value that's stored in memory. So a lot of times in life, a name can mean different things in different contexts. So for instance, if I'm referring to somebody named Ethan, which Ethan am I referring to? Or if I'm referring to a certain street address, that might make a lot of sense in a certain city, but will it make sense in some other city? When I use certain functions or commands like speak, which module am I in? What does speak mean if I wrote that function in this module versus speak in a different module? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about, well, we won't talk about it, but we worry also about files, right? Can we have two files with the same name? Well, we can if we're in a different directory. And that's kind of the idea behind scope. What's the context for the name that we're using? So we might have names that are reused in a program. We might have names for variables that are valid in one part of a program, but not in other parts of the program. And we're going to want some way to kind of figure out how to keep that all straight. A term we're going to use today to keep that all straight is called frames. Frames are ways that the Python interpreter kind of keeps things organized while it's running different functions during a program. Let's talk a little bit more about frames. So we've been practicing calling functions and writing functions, and sometimes we use the word invoking a function. Every time a function is invoked, the Python interpreter creates space in memory to store all the information that is important to that function. And that space in memory has kind of a mental concept called a frame. So when we pass arguments into parameters, those parameters store those values of those arguments, and they exist somewhere right in the computer's memory, and the mental model that we have for that is a frame. So each function, when it's called, causes a frame to be created in the memory of the computer. There is always a global frame in our program. The global frame is made as soon as the Python interpreter starts running our program. So when Python sees any variable name anywhere in the program, the first thing that it does is it looks in the frame that this function or this variable lives in, and that's created by the function. And if it doesn't find the name of the variable that you're talking about in that frame for that function, it then looks at the global frame and checks to see if the function is there. That's how the interpreter knows if the variable that you're talking about is valid. So here's an example from the textbook Think Python. I see two functions defined here. One is called print twice, one is called cat twice, and then outside of the two functions that are defined, I see three lines of code, right? Line 9, 10, and 11. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can fix that. That was kind of silly. Let's see. I know what happened. Okay, now we're back to normal. So here's our example again. Where are the frames in this program? Well, lines 9, 10, and 11 are not in a function. They're the global frame. And so those variables, line 1 variable and line 2, those variables are in the global frame. There are two functions here, and when we call cat twice, in line 11 we call cat twice. When we get to cat twice, we call print twice. During that moment, there will be two frames added to the global frame, one for each function call, because print twice will be called from within cat twice. So even though we don't have to worry about frames when we're programming, and even though we don't have access to control the frames when our program is running, that is all done by the Python interpreter, it's still important to understand what's happening with frames. And again, the big reason for this is to try to avoid the errors in our code that are so hard to detect. So let's kind of take the idea of what I just told you and put it into the idea of frames. In the textbook at Think Python, written by Downey, Downey likes to draw pictures like this. And so we want to show you an example of a program and then show you the diagram or image that comes from the textbook and explain to you what that means. Downey calls it a stack diagram. Basically, a stack diagram is basically the same thing as a frame diagram. So you'll often hear those two words used interchangeably, frame or stack. Here I see main with the variables that were created in main, namely line 1 and line 2. Here I see the frame called cat twice, and cat twice is well, I guess the frame is the same as the function, I guess, right? The frame created when the function cat twice was invoked. And I see that in this line of code, we have a variable called part1, a variable called part2. Those are parameters that are in the function header. I see a local variable called cat, and you can see the values that were passed in. And then in line 7 here of our program, print twice is called. And so then a new frame is created when print twice is called. The value of cat is passed into print twice and stored in the parameter Bruce, which is kind of a silly name for a parameter. So you can see all the variables in our program. You can see what frame they belong to, and you can see the value of those variables. What I want to try to focus on here is not just all the frames, but also which variables are accessible in different parts of the program. So at the start of the program, you know, those definitions that we saw earlier in the program are not run. They're just stored in the computer's memory. And so really this program starts running where it says line 1 gets bing tiddle, line 2 gets tiddle bang. And those variables are stored in the global frame. And so main is another name for the global frame. And anywhere in this part of our code, this code can access the variables that are in the global frame. It cannot access the variables in these functions, which is why I cover them up. Once we call the function cat twice, a new frame is made for cat twice. We go to that frame. The frame isn't made until the function is invoked. And so when we're in this part of the code, between lines 5 and 8, in the function cat twice, our code can access the variables that are in this function. That includes the parameters part1, part2. That includes the local variable cat. It can also access the global variables that are in the global frame. What about when we go to the function print twice? By the way, what I should have done there is covered up the other function. And so what's really happening when we call cat twice is that I can cover up this other function because we don't really have access to that. So from the function print twice, anywhere inside of that code, we can access Bruce. We can access line 1 and line 2. Those are variables in the global frame. When we can access something, we call that being in scope. And so because I can access certain variables, we say that those variables are in scope. When we cannot access other variables, we say those variables are out of scope or not in scope. And in this example right now, if we're inside of the function print twice, then the variables that belong to the function cat twice are out of scope. We cannot access them. We'll get errors in our code if we're writing code in the function print twice and trying to access variables that are not in scope. I want to talk to you next about arguments. Arguments are copied to parameters in a process called pass by value. What that means is that when we're calling print twice, we are wondering how is the value stored in the parameter Bruce and what's actually going on. So what's actually going on is that line 1 and line 2 are passed into cat twice, and they're stored locally, basically a copy of that literal value of that string is made, and a copy is placed in the variable part 1 and the variable part 2. They are two separate copies of the same thing. They are not the same thing. They are two copies, and kind of like cloning. If I was for some reason in the function cat twice and made a change to the variable part 1 in cat twice, let's say I changed it to pfft, like that, it would not change the value of line 1 because these are two separate copies. And so I would say the changes made to a parameter will not affect its twin in the main frame. This is an idea that we're going to show you examples of in a bit, and I'm about to show you some examples from the Python tutor. We're going to go to a website called Python Tutor, and Python Tutor will show you this really nicely in an interactive way, but it uses slightly different naming. And so on the right hand side here, I'm showing you what it's going to look like in the Python tutor. In the book, Downey uses main in the stack diagram, and Python tutor is going to call that the global frame. It's going to have a frame for each function, and you'll see those frames, but you'll notice that they won't appear until they are invoked. And so this stack diagram is called a frame diagram in Python tutor. It's basically the same thing. So for instance, you will see boxes, and you'll see variables stored in boxes instead of variables getting values. You'll see the term global frame instead of main, and you'll see function definitions, even though you don't see function definitions in the book. So the book won't show function definitions, but a global frame knows what functions it can call. And so you'll see those functions that are available in the global frame listed there. All right, that was a lot for you to take in one piece. My suggestion for you is that before you leave this video, you should pause for a second and see if you can explain the first learning objective and the third learning objective. The second one, I'm not going to show you all of it yet because we're going to show you some things in the coding examples. Thanks for watching. The next video is going to be a demo in Python Tutor.